When people think of Julius Caesar, they usually picture a ruthless dictator, a brilliant military commander, or simply the man who was stabbed 23 times on the Ides of March. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about Caesar isn't how he died, it's how he rose to power in the first place. Because Julius Caesar didn't seize control of Rome through a sudden coup or a violent revolution. Instead, he did something far more remarkable. He gradually turned the rules of the Roman Republic against the Republic itself, accumulating power step by step until he became the most powerful man Rome had ever seen. And that's exactly why we're still talking about him more than 2,000 years later. Caesar's story isn't just the story of one extraordinary man. It's a case study in how political systems function and how they can slowly begin to unravel from within. For centuries, the Roman Republic had been one of the most sophisticated political systems of the ancient world. It was built on elections, powerful institutions, and a complex system of checks and balances, all designed to prevent any single individual from becoming king again. After overthrowing their monarchy centuries earlier, the Romans believed they had created a system that could never be dominated by one man. And yet, despite all those safeguards, one politician managed to concentrate more power in his own hands than any Roman before him. How was that possible? Was Julius Caesar simply a once-in-a-generation political genius? Or had the Republic already become so fragile that someone like him was almost inevitable? To answer that question, we have to stop looking at Julius Caesar as a military commander and start looking at him as something even more important, a politician.
To understand Caesar's rise, we first have to understand the republic he inherited. Looking back, it's tempting to imagine Rome as an unstoppable superpower, a stable republic destined to become the greatest empire in history. But that's not the Rome Julius Caesar was born into. By the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was already showing signs of deep political decay. Military victories had made Rome incredibly wealthy, but that wealth was distributed unevenly. A small elite accumulated enormous fortunes, while many ordinary citizens struggled to compete with vast estates worked by slaves. Economic inequality continued to grow, and with it, public frustration. At the same time, politics had become increasingly dysfunctional. The Senate was divided into rival factions, elections were plagued by corruption, and ambitious politicians cared less about protecting the republic than defeating their political opponents. Compromise was becoming rare. Loyalty to institutions was slowly being replaced by loyalty to powerful individuals. The military was changing as well. Traditionally, Roman soldiers fought for the Republic, but after the reforms of Gaius Marius, many soldiers became personally loyal to the generals who could promise them land, wealth, and a future after their service. That shift would fundamentally change Roman politics. An ambitious politician no longer needed only votes in the Senate. He could also command the loyalty of an army. The Republic had already experienced the consequences of this transformation. Just a generation before Caesar, the dictator Sulla marched his own legions on Rome itself, an act that had once seemed unthinkable. He seized power by force, purged his enemies, and then voluntarily stepped down. Although the Republic survived, an important precedent had been set. If someone possessed enough military power, even Rome's laws could be bent. This was the world Julius Caesar entered. He didn't invent political instability. He didn't create corruption or factionalism, and he certainly wasn't the first Roman willing to stretch the rules for personal gain. What made Caesar different was that he understood something his rivals did not. A republic doesn't have to collapse all at once. If its institutions are weak enough, and if the right person knows how to exploit them, it can be taken over one step at a time.
Despite his ambition, Julius Caesar wasn't born into a position of overwhelming power. Compared to many of Rome's leading aristocrats, his political career began with more disadvantages than advantages. He came from an old and respected family, but one that had long since lost much of its influence.
More importantly, he lacked the two things that truly mattered in Roman politics: money and military prestige. In the late Republic, elections were extraordinarily expensive. Public games, lavish banquets, and political campaigns all required enormous sums of money. To build his reputation, Caesar borrowed heavily, accumulating debts that would have ruined most politicians. But he understood something many of his rivals didn't. In Rome, popularity was an investment. If he could win enough public support, political power, and eventually wealth would follow. Still, popularity alone wasn't enough. Caesar needed allies who possessed what he lacked. That opportunity came in 60 BC with the formation of what historians now call the First Triumvirate. It wasn't an official institution or a constitutional reform. It was a private agreement between three of the most influential men in Rome. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in the Republic. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great, was its most celebrated general. And Caesar was the ambitious politician who needed both. Each man wanted something different. Pompey sought land for his veterans and political recognition for his eastern campaigns. Crassus wanted legislation that favored his financial interests. Caesar wanted the consulship, and, more importantly, a provincial command that could launch his career. Alone, none of them could consistently overcome the resistance of the Senate. Together, they could. The First Triumvirate wasn't the moment Caesar became the most powerful man in Rome, but it was the moment he learned one of the most important lessons of politics. Power doesn't always come from defeating your rivals. Sometimes it comes from convincing them that helping you also helps themselves. The alliance gave Caesar exactly what he needed: a path to the consulship in 59 BC, and shortly afterward, the governorship of Gaul. At the time, it may have seemed like just another political compromise. In reality, it was the beginning of everything.
Long before Julius Caesar became Rome's greatest general, he had already become one of its most effective politicians. To understand why, we first need to understand how political power worked in the Roman Republic. Although the Senate played a central role in governing the state, its authority depended heavily on public support. Elections mattered, public opinion mattered, and ambitious politicians were constantly competing for visibility, influence, and prestige. Politics in Rome wasn't just fought in the Senate, it was fought in the streets. Caesar understood this better than most of his contemporaries. While many senators relied on tradition, family reputation, and elite connections, Caesar focused on something far more unpredictable: the Roman people. Throughout his early political career, he invested enormous sums of money into public games, religious festivals, and lavish celebrations. These events weren't simply acts of generosity. They were political investments designed to build recognition, loyalty, and public goodwill. The strategy came at a tremendous cost. By the time Caesar reached the highest offices of the Republic, he had accumulated debts so large that many believed he would never be able to repay them. To his critics, it looked reckless. But Caesar wasn't spending money because he was irresponsible. He was spending it because he believed popularity was worth more than wealth. That made him fundamentally different from many of his rivals. While they viewed political office as the reward for power, Caesar saw it as a means of acquiring even greater power. Every election won, every crowd impressed, and every public appearance strengthened his position in ways that couldn't easily be measured. Just as importantly, Caesar carefully shaped his political image. He consistently portrayed himself as a champion of the Roman people, often presenting his proposals as serving the public interest, while casting many of his opponents as defenders of a privileged elite. Whether that image reflected his true motivations is still debated by historians. What matters is that it proved remarkably effective. Popularity, however, could only take him so far. Public support could help him win elections and outmaneuver political rivals, but it couldn't guarantee his long-term security. As long as his influence depended on the shifting dynamics of Roman politics,
it could still be challenged or taken away. If Caesar wanted lasting power, he needed something that elections alone could never provide. He needed an army.
At first glance, Caesar's appointment as governor of Gaul looked like a routine political success. After serving as consul in 59 BC, it was only natural for him to receive command over a Roman province. But in reality, Gaul offered something far more important than another prestigious office. It gave Caesar the opportunity to build a power base that no politician in Rome could match. In the late Republic, military success was one of the most effective ways to gain political influence. Victorious generals returned home with wealth, prestige, and the admiration of the Roman people. Caesar understood this better than anyone. If he wanted to dominate Roman politics, he first had to become indispensable to it. Over the next 8 years, he led a series of campaigns that would later become known as the Gallic Wars. By the end of the conflict, Rome had expanded its territory across most of what is now modern-day France and parts of Belgium and Switzerland. Militarily, the campaign was an extraordinary success. Politically, it was even more significant. The conquest of Gaul transformed Caesar in ways that no election in Rome ever could. It made him enormously wealthy, allowing him to finance his political ambitions without depending on powerful patrons. It earned him unparalleled military prestige and turned him into one of the Republic's most celebrated commanders. Most importantly, it gave him the loyalty of battle-hardened legions who had spent years fighting under his command. That loyalty was becoming increasingly important. The Roman army was no longer just an institution that served the Republic. Soldiers often identified more closely with the generals who led them than with the politicians who governed from the Senate. Victorious commanders rewarded their troops with wealth, land, and opportunities, creating personal bonds that could outweigh loyalty to the state itself. Caesar didn't create this system, but he understood how to use it better than almost anyone else.
Yet his greatest weapon wasn't military force. It was his ability to shape how those victories were remembered. Throughout the Gallic Wars, Caesar published a series of accounts known as the Commentari de Bello Gallico. Written in clear and remarkably restrained prose, they presented his campaigns as factual reports rather than political propaganda. But that's precisely what made them so effective. Caesar controlled the narrative before anyone else had the chance to. He portrayed himself as a rational commander acting in Rome's best interests, while framing his enemies as dangerous threats that justified each new campaign. Even today, much of what we know about the Gallic Wars comes from Caesar's own writings. That should remind us that his greatest talent wasn't simply winning battles. It was convincing others that those victories were both necessary and inevitable. By the time the campaigns in Gaul came to an end, Caesar possessed everything a Roman politician could hope for: immense wealth, unmatched military prestige, a fiercely loyal army, and enormous public support. The Senate still held constitutional authority, but for the first time in generations, one individual possessed enough personal power to challenge the Republic itself. The conquest of Gaul wasn't the moment Caesar took control of Rome. It was the moment Rome lost the ability to control Caesar.
Few moments in history have become as symbolic as Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon in 49 BC. Today, the phrase "crossing the Rubicon" has become synonymous with making an irreversible decision. But history often has a way of turning long, complicated processes into a single dramatic moment. The reality was far less simple. By the time Caesar reached the banks of the Rubicon, the Republic had already spent years drifting toward confrontation. His victories in Gaul had made him richer, more popular, and militarily stronger than almost anyone else in Rome. To many ordinary Romans, he was a celebrated hero. To many senators, he had become an existential threat. The Senate now faced a dilemma of its own making.
Caesar's command in Gaul was coming to an end, and according to Roman law, he was expected to disband his army before returning to Rome. Once he did, he would lose the military protection that had secured his position for nearly a decade. His political enemies would almost certainly prosecute him for actions taken during his consulship, effectively ending his career. From Caesar's perspective, surrendering his command wasn't simply a legal formality. It was a political gamble with everything he had built. Negotiations followed. Caesar proposed compromises that would allow both him and Pompey to lay down their commands simultaneously. His opponents rejected them, convinced that yielding to Caesar would only strengthen his position further. Mutual distrust had reached the point where neither side believed the other would act in good faith. By early 49 BC, the conflict was no longer about a single office or a single law. It had become a struggle over who would define the future of the Republic itself. When Caesar finally crossed the Rubicon with the 13th Legion, he wasn't making a spontaneous decision. The political system had gradually narrowed his options until every path seemed to lead toward confrontation. Whether he genuinely believed he was defending his rights or simply seized the opportunity to claim supreme power is still debated by historians. What is beyond dispute is that once the river had been crossed, there was no peaceful way back. The civil war that followed wasn't the result of one reckless decision. It was the consequence of years of escalating political conflict that neither Caesar nor the Senate proved willing or able to resolve.
Caesar emerged from the civil war victorious. Pompey was dead. His political opponents had either been defeated or forced into exile. And for the first time in decades, one man stood above everyone else in Roman politics.
What followed wasn't the immediate collapse of the Republic. In fact, many of its institutions continued to exist. The Senate still met, magistrates were still elected, Republican offices remained in place. But increasingly, they existed alongside a political reality in which Caesar's authority overshadowed them all. In the years after his victory, Caesar introduced a series of significant reforms. He reorganized provincial administration, addressed debt issues, expanded the Senate, settled thousands of veterans, and introduced what would become one of his most enduring legacies, the Julian calendar, a system so effective that its basic structure is still reflected in the calendar we use today. These reforms earned him genuine support. Many Romans saw Caesar as a leader who was bringing stability after years of political chaos and civil war. To them, he wasn't destroying the Republic. He was saving it. Others saw something very different. With each new honor, each new office, and each extension of his authority, Caesar became increasingly difficult to challenge. He was appointed dictator for 10 years, and later dictator for life. Statues were erected in his honor. His image appeared alongside those of Rome's legendary kings. Whether Caesar actively sought these distinctions or merely accepted what others offered him remains a matter of debate. But perception mattered just as much as intention. To many senators, the Republic was no longer protected by its institutions. It depended entirely on the choices of one individual. That was precisely the situation the Roman Republic had been designed to prevent.
For nearly 5 centuries, Roman politics had rested on one fundamental principle: no citizen should become powerful enough to stand above the law. Caesar hadn't formally abolished the Republic, but many believed he had rendered its constitutional safeguards meaningless. If every important decision ultimately depended on one man, what remained of the Republic beyond its name? For modern audiences, Caesar's assassination often appears to be a simple story of betrayal. But to understand why it happened, we have to see the event from the perspective of the men who carried it out. Many of the conspirators genuinely believed that Caesar's growing authority posed a fundamental threat to the Republic. In their eyes, the issue was no longer Caesar himself, but the political system he had created. If one individual could accumulate so much power without meaningful opposition,
then the institutions that had defined the Republic for centuries had effectively lost their purpose. Whether that assessment was justified remains one of the great debates of Roman history. Some historians argue that Caesar intended to preserve the Republic while reforming it. Others believe he had already reduced it to little more than a constitutional facade. Whatever his intentions may have been, by 44 BC, a significant number of senators had reached the same conclusion. As long as Caesar remained alive, they believed the Republic could not be restored. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, more than 60 senators gathered around Caesar during a meeting of the Senate. Within moments, they stabbed him to death. They believed they had killed the man who threatened the Republic. Instead, they removed the last person capable of controlling what came next.
If the conspirators believed that killing Caesar would restore the Roman Republic, history delivered a very different verdict. Rather than bringing an end to political instability, Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into another series of civil wars. The constitutional crisis that had been building for decades did not disappear with his death. If anything, it became even more destructive. The men who had stabbed Caesar expected the Republic to reassert itself once its greatest threat was gone. Instead, they discovered that the Republic had become too weak to survive without him. Within months, Rome was once again divided between competing factions. Caesar's supporters sought revenge, his enemies struggled to defend their actions, and political violence returned on an even greater scale. The Republic that the conspirators had hoped to preserve was now collapsing under the weight of the very conflict they had hoped to prevent. Out of that chaos emerged Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian. Unlike Caesar, Octavian had learned an important lesson. He understood that openly concentrating power in the hands of one individual created resistance. Rather than abolishing the Republic, he preserved its appearance. The Senate continued to meet. Elections continued to take place. Republican offices continued to exist. But real political power rested with one man. When Octavian became Augustus, Rome officially entered a new era. The Republic still existed in name, but the political system that had governed Rome for nearly 5 centuries had effectively come to an end. In many ways, that was Caesar's greatest legacy. Not because he founded the Roman Empire himself, but because he demonstrated that the Republic's institutions could no longer contain an individual who possessed enough military power, political influence, and public support. That is why Julius Caesar remains one of history's most influential figures. His story isn't simply about military conquest or political ambition. It is a reminder that political systems rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, they erode gradually, as institutions weaken, norms are abandoned, and power becomes increasingly concentrated in the hands of a single individual. Caesar didn't invent that process. He simply understood it better than anyone else.